Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special episode of R-Rated. Last week, I had been building up to the release of Spider-Man No Way Home by walking through a number of the previous Spider-Man movies over the years that Sony has put together prior to his inclusion in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Originally, I figured I would do the same for the movies that followed once Tom Holland became the new Spider-Man, but I realized that a couple of his inclusions were a lot smaller or more incidental than others, and it started to get a little bit oddly shaped. So I figured what I'd do instead is, especially because Tom Holland's MCU Spider-Man is a lot fresher in people's memories, I was going to combine them into one video. So what I'm doing today is looking at all of the appearances of Tom Holland as Spider-Man in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We're going to walk through each of them in the final lead up to No Way Home. So we have a couple of them to look at, and we're going to start off with so it takes its namesake from a comic book miniseries of the same. I guess it's less of a miniseries. It's one of the universe spanning style, maybe less universe, but comic spread spanning events in Marvel Comics over a superhuman registration act that saw Iron Man and the pro-registration side fighting against Captain America and the anti-registration side. I sure hope I got those right. I'm pretty sure I did. And we're seeing a somewhat of a version of that in this. Ironically, so it's interesting. People kind of complain that Civil War doesn't match up very well to the comic, but at the same time, the Civil War comic also got a lot of flack for characters acting like wildly out of character for how they normally would and how they'd settle differences and things. This movie does it a bit, but I think the writers over time, and Kevin Feige especially as kind of the executive producer of this whole thing, the sort of showrunner of the MCU, has been very careful to make sure that these characters' arcs have been going in the right direction to make it seem a little bit more natural that they'd be fighting over these ideals. I'm not going to cover the whole movie. Rather, we're going to take a look at Spider-Man's inclusion in this film. So in the lead up to the big fight, the Avenger versus Avenger, showdown at the Berlin airport, the idea is that Tony is sort of realizing that he needs to bring Steve in. He's trying to capture him. He doesn't want to kill him. He wants to bring him in, essentially arrest him for violating the Sokovia Accords, as well as capturing Bucky, capturing Sam Wilson, and any accomplices that he has. So his plan is that he's apparently been keeping an eye on someone in Queens who has been displaying some interesting talents and abilities, and winds up dropping in on a young Peter Parker, who I think in this movie is supposed to be about 15, give or take, might be maybe 16. And he, about 6 months before, had been bitten by the spider, had gained these incredible powers, and since then has been showing up on YouTube here and there with amateur cell phone coverage of him swinging by, stopping car accidents with buses and things, displaying a pretty huge amount of strength. That's actually something that's really interesting about this version of Spider-Man, is that compared with the other two who pull off some pretty considerable feats of strength. I'd say Tobey Maguire is, especially with the train scene in Spider-Man 2, Tom Holland seems to be on another level entirely in terms of durability and strength. He stops a full speed car crash with a bus like it's nothing. And these abilities, especially his web shooters, which are again mechanical, they're not biological in this movie, is really what's got Tony Stark's attention. So essentially he brings him in with the plan that we're going to show up, we're going to go to this airport to meet, and you are going to take away Captain America's shield and web him up so that we can detain him and bring him in. And this works for a second, except that Hawkeye is on Captain America's team and is able to slice through the webbing with an arrow, and at this point all hell breaks loose as ultimately a dozen Avengers all go toe-to-toe with each other. There's a lot of great sequences in here. Peter Parker's already quipping and stuff all over the place. He's talking so much that it's annoying the people that he's fighting, with the exception of Steve, who is pretty charmed by the whole thing, and they kind of have a quick heart-to-heart, and like, where are you from, kid? Queens. Brooklyn. And then they go their separate ways. It's done pretty well, I would say. I think it's a really solid introduction to Peter Parker. We don't get his origin story the way that we normally would. Instead, it's kind of told to us through Peter to Tony, which is kind of a refreshing change. We don't need to see the spider bite him. We don't need to see Uncle Ben die. We don't need to see, the standard same old stuff that happens every time. So what we get instead is kind of a Spider-Man that's already sort of in the midst of his early days. He's still very much doing, like, dealing with petty crime and things, and he's doing the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man thing, to the point where he does have a name. He does, Tony Stark kind of sarcastically is like, Spider-Boy, the Spiderling? He's like, Spider-Man. Like, he's not very confident about it, but it's cool to see a different take on early Spider-Man. And I guess all three of these franchises have done it differently, but this one kind of goes out of its way to not retread the same ground again, which I find really refreshing. And he's learned the lesson, the important lesson, in kind of an interesting way. When you can do the things that I can, but you don't, and then the bad things happen, they happen because of you, which is kind of an interesting... It's an interesting twist on it because it feels a little bit more guilt-ridden than the standard with great power comes great responsibility. It's the same idea, but rather than how the lesson was imparted the first two franchises, where it's like, if you have the ability to do something, it's on you to do something. You have the responsibility to do something, as close to the second franchise version of that as that came out. Whereas this one is like, if you don't do something and something bad happens, that's your fault. Like, it's a little bit more blunt, and it's also kind of a bit more appropriate for the lesson that a teenager would take away from it after dealing with some pretty considerable trauma. We don't know the details of how Uncle Ben died. We know that he did die. We don't know really how, though, and we can assume that it's kind of similar to what happened in the other two franchises. Peter Parker also, among other things, to show off just how strong and nimble and, how strong spider sense is and all of that, he's able to pretty handily take down both Bucky and Sam Wilson at the same time, which is extremely difficult to do. And to the point also where he's talking so much that both of them are like, you're kind of new to this, aren't you? And he's like, oh, sorry, I'll stop talking now. And they get back to fighting. So Peter kind of serves as, among other things, the comic relief of Team Iron Man, and forms kind of an interesting counterpart to Ant-Man on Captain America's side, where both of them are kind of the more comedic parts to the fight. And this even results in Peter webbing up, or not even webbing up, just kind of tangling up Scott when he goes to Giant Man for the first time, I guess the second time in universe, but the first time we see it, and makes reference to that really old movie Empire Strikes Back. And everyone's like, Jesus Christ, Tony, how old is this kid? He's like, I know, don't worry about it. There's also an interesting parallel here between Spider-Man and Black Panther. This is the first movie that either of them appear in, though Black Panther is way more central to the overall plot, whereas Spider-Man is basically just here for the airport fight. Spider-Man was also a fairly last-second inclusion because the deal with Sony had worked out kind of at the last possible moment. Because this movie came out in 2016. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was 2014, which means basically 2015, summer of 2015, that's when the talks finally, happen after falling through before. Spider-Man's going to be in the MCU. Amazing Spider-Man is done. And just like, boom, it just kind of got thrown in there. And about 2 years later, I think technically less than 2 years after The Amazing Spider-Man 2, a different Spider-Man is arriving in the MCU. So it was kind of a big deal. And the suit looks great. It's a nice kind of minimalist design, I would say, compared to the other two, where Tobey Maguire's is very like busy and has a lot of like stuff going on, like physical, like rubberized stuff on the outside of it. And Andrew Garfield's has a lot more like design elements kind of happening with it. It's also darker and sleeker and all that. This one's much more function over form. Very basic kind of design. I love the eyes. The eyes are the best part. They finally managed to figure out how to get Spider-Man's eyes to work in movies, because both of the previous franchises, the eyes were completely stationary. They couldn't do anything. And so you had to really rely on some good physical acting to get the point across. And you still do. When you play a character in a mask, you kind of have to go physical in order to get the point across sometimes. But by being able to have these like these iris shutters essentially for eyes, it means that they can do a lot more stuff to make him way more expressive in the suit. And that holds true for all of this stuff. I think actually later on when he wears like his old school goggles again, they even have kind of slits that kind of open and close to like show some expressiveness there too. So a really good introduction for Peter Parker. I think it was a good introduction for Spider-Man, especially since everybody knows Spider-Man's origin story. It's the same issue I take with a lot of Batman reboots at this point, is like, we know we don't need to see Crime Alley. We don't need to see the pearl necklace falling and clattering on the ground. We get it. We've seen this origin story like almost a dozen times now over the last 40 years. We're good. We got it. Actually, over the last like 32 years, I think, at this point. 1989, I think, was Batman with Michael Keaton. And yeah, since then, it's been literally like 10 times we've seen the Waynes get gunned down. It's getting a little embarrassing at this point. But yeah, so it was a really awesome thing to have Spider-Man show up in this essentially Avengers 2.5, right? Nice and early in Phase 3 for the MCU, and the biggest non-Avengers film at that point wound up literally closing with the line, Spider-Man will return, in big, bold letters on the screen. So, like, that was a pretty huge thing. And the next year, we got our very first Spider-Man movie in the MCU, Spider-Man Homecoming. And I was about to make that a transition, and I realized that I didn't give this one a rating. I give Captain America Civil War a 7. I really enjoyed the movie a lot, but there's a kind of a distinction I have to make between, you know, how much fun did I have watching the movie and how good was the movie in general. There's a lot of elements that are kind of hard to get behind. Characters are kind of acting a little bit awkwardly and out of character at times, not as much as the comics, but it does still happen. We've got characters fighting and quipping at each other about the fact that they're fighting. Everyone's pulling their punches left and right. But I have to say that T'Challa was an amazing addition in this movie. Baron Zemo wound up being a really compelling villain. Maybe the first truly interesting villain that this series has had altogether. Just kind of running through the other villains in my head, I think Helmut Zemo might be the first really, really good villain in the MCU. And yeah, I would have to say that like Phase 3 is kind of where you could tell the writers were focusing on making their villains a lot deeper, give them a lot more depth to them, because so many of the first 12 villains essentially were really shallow, really one-dimensional, and Helmut Zemo is a pretty solid departure from that, and I think they did a solid job with that. Yeah. So now we will move on to Spider-Man Homecoming is a 2017 movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Taking place after the events of Captain America Civil War, we are going into Peter Parker's, I think, sophomore year? I think this is supposed to be sophomore year of high school. And what we wind up with is an extremely like 80s style teen comedy wrapped up in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. You have a lot of elements of these other very popular teen movies in general, not just comedies, but also the ones that are more focused on the romance and all of that, and school crushes and prom and all of these like really classic film kind of things as far as like teen movies. And it's neat to see that sort of genre come out here, because Peter Parker is a great opportunity to get into that, especially because at this point in his life, like, you know, in particular, he's a big dork. He's actually believably just this quiet kind of, like, he's not like a shut-in, but he doesn't really have many friends. He's basically got Ned, and he's at least got like the vague acquaintanceness with the you know, school decathlon, the high school B team, essentially. And we kind of see that the interactions are like, all right, they're like friendly with each other, but they're not really friends exactly. There's even a scene that is a direct homage to Ferris Bueller's Day Off. If you're familiar with the like the little of Ferris Bueller running through a bunch of like backyards and things. They didn't quite need to go as far as they did with it, though, because they literally have a TV at one point during the scene where he's running in his Spider-Man outfit through a bunch of backyards, and they've got Ferris Bueller doing the same thing on TV. And I'm like, don't explain the joke. Trust me, the people who would get it, get it. If you have to explain to someone, oh, this is a movie, see, this is Ferris Bueller's Day Off, it's like, they're not the people who would have gotten it in the first place. And anybody who knows Ferris Bueller's Day Off is going to immediately recognize this. So, you know. But yeah, so what I really appreciate about Spider-Man Homecoming is that for the first time, we are actually focusing on Peter Parker in high school. Finally. Spider-Man 1 with Tobey Maguire more or less starts with them doing some stuff at school and then graduating high school. And then that's it. We don't see anything else from there. The Amazing Spider-Man starts a little earlier than that, but Amazing Spider-Man 2 starts with graduation. So this time, instead, we're setting it at least another year before that. And this time, Peter Parker is like a sophomore in high school, and we actually get to see what his school life is kind of like. He's trying to balance school life and home life and being Spider-Man, especially now that he's got a suit made by Tony Stark with all kinds of wacky gadgets and things. And he's struggling after being involved with the Avengers with kind of this childish need to be taken seriously and like, I'm an adult, I can do this. And he starts getting in way over his head. He starts to try taking on essentially a weapons deal, a weapons syndicate, essentially, that's selling all kinds of weird exotic weapons forged from Chitauri material. And not even just there. Like, they basically scavenge anywhere the Avengers have been for the last decade in universe. Adrian Toomes and his crew, which includes the Tinkerer, Phineas Mason, anywhere the Avengers go, they scoop up a bunch of leftover stuff behind them in order to make weapons and sell them out on the streets. So now we're dealing with a lot of crime using super weapons, and Spider-Man feels responsible for taking them out. The other big thing here, aside from just showing off, here's Peter in high school, we actually get to see really decent-sized amounts of Peter's intelligence. His scientific mind actually comes into play in this movie. We see him, you know, doing all kinds of chemistry shit, and like he's got his web fluid formula that he figured out, and like he's sketching stuff down, and it's just nice to see him actually being treated as someone who is showing off that he actually is intelligent and is scientifically minded, as opposed to just being told like, oh yeah, no, he's very smart. I promise, he won an award. He's very smart. So that is a really comforting thing to have here with Peter Parker. I really like that we actually get a lot more depth to him, because both of the previous ones were a little shallow in that department. And especially with the Tobey Maguire ones, we don't even really get much of an attempt with that. Once he's Spider-Man, the focus is just Spider-Man, and man, it's hard to be Spider-Man and a person. But we don't really get a lot of depth beyond that. This really gets into it pretty well, and I think it's cool that we get to see that. As well as we don't really go like a liar revealed path, but his time as Spider-Man, he keeps calling the Stark internship because Tony lied for him to come out to Berlin. And so Peter is now able to use this as an excuse for why he's disappearing all the time. He needs to help Tony Stark. He's doing stuff over there. He's really trying to make sure that he can get into college because he really wants to get into MIT. But yeah, so like that's kind of an interesting angle for them to take. The cast is really, really good. Our main three for the entirety of these Spider-Man movies, we have Tom Holland as Peter Parker, who actually looks like, you know, maybe not necessarily a high schooler, but definitely way the hell closer than the other two. It is certainly believable, whereas the other two, it was very not. Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield were not believable as high school students. Tom Holland is. So that was really good to see. We have Zendaya as MJ. I don't think she even gets named at all until... Oh, no, she doesn't get named at all until the end of the movie. And then she's called Michelle. I think she gets named Michelle once or twice before then. But then she's like, my friends call me MJ. And they're like, oh, okay. So this is where that's going. That's pretty cool. And we have, of course, Jacob Batalon as Ned Leeds, Peter's best friend, and the guy in the chair, which is a really charming. It's really cool to have this character who is like pumped to just help out, and it's really cool. He's inspired by a bunch of different friends of Peter Parker from over the years in the comics, mostly Genki Lee, who is from the Ultimate Universe in Marvel, Ultimate Spider-Man. He's actually in Spider-Man Miles Morales, since that's taking some cues from the Ultimate Universe as well. I mean, most of its cues are coming from the Ultimate Universe. We have Marissa Tomei as Aunt May. I love Marissa Tomei. I am always happy to see her in anything, so I was thrilled that she is Aunt May, and she does a great job of being... It's interesting, we had Rosemary Harris as kind of a grandmothery Aunt May. We had Sally Field as a very much like tired, just trying to make ends meet Aunt May. And now we have Marissa Tomei as this almost like... It's interesting. Something about Sally Field's one is like, okay, it's an aunt. It's a little bit more of a you know, an older aunt. Marissa Tomei's is a bit younger and is a bit almost like she's got almost this like cool mom energy, not in a very destructive way, but she's very like, she keeps up with Peter really well. But she's also pretty firm with him about stuff too. And she's not just like ignorant to the fact that he's vanishing all the time and he's getting himself hurt and all of these things. So like, it's cool to see that coming out of this as well. Finally, we have Michael Keaton as Adrian Toomes, who is just crushing it in this movie. He might be my favorite villain in Spider-Man. Of like all of these movies, including the ones we haven't even talked about yet, I think the Vulture, Adrian Toomes, might be my favorite. And the reason being, he is by far the most grounded and believable. The most ungrounded thing about him is that his flight suit has actual talons on it. That seems a little much. Everything else, though, he's got a completely comprehensible motivation for doing what he's doing. He is firm about the fact that so there comes a point, a rather famous scene, there comes a point where he discovers that Peter Parker is Spider-Man while he's literally in his presence, and after the two of them are alone, he basically makes it very clear to him that he's not even ultimately as concerned about, like, he doesn't care about going to jail, he doesn't care about like his crew, he doesn't care about all those things. He's like, if you fuck up my daughter's life by screwing with me, I will kill everyone you know. Like, he's just very like, that is what he's here for, that is what he's doing it for. And we wind up seeing this be kind of a like reaffirmed later when so Spider-Man does ultimately take down the Vulture, but he goes out of his way to save him. He almost blows himself up by carrying away a bunch of, was it arc reactors? I forget exactly what it was. It was something that was going critical, and he was trying to fly away with it, and Peter was barely able to get him away from it in time, and then web him up, and then he goes to jail. but obviously Adrian is appreciative of it when Mac Gargan, the Scorpion in most Spider-Man materials, though he hasn't shown up as the Scorpion yet. I'm curious if he will turn up for that. He winds up confronting Adrian and, you know, being like, you know who Spider-Man is, don't you? And Adrian very coolly is like, if I knew who Spider-Man was, he'd be dead already. And then it's like, your family's here, and he goes off and sees his family. And it's like, he does Peter a solid, essentially, in exchange for his life. He's like, all right, I'm not going to go send people after him to kill him because he saved my life, so I owe him that in return. Really cool stuff. The two biggest holy shit moments of this are definitely Peter has asked out his crush Liz Allen to prom, and he gets to the doorstep, and who opens the door? Adrian Toomes. The Vulture is Liz's dad. And, like, in the theater, like, nobody saw this one coming. Everyone in the theater is like, oh, shit. Oh, God. Okay. That's interesting. And Peter is, like, he is, like, pale and sweating and just like, The second one being, in the car scene, it's Adrian driving Peter and Liz to prom. And Liz keeps saying stuff, bringing up the DC trip because the school decathlon, you know, thing was in DC, and he had to become Spider-Man to save everyone from falling in an elevator in the Washington Monument. And Liz won't stop talking about it to the point where it becomes clear to Adrian that Peter was missing, but Spider-Man was there. But Spider-Man's usually in New York, and he finally puts it all together. And there's a spot where there's a red light that's on his face because they're literally sitting at a red light. So the stoplight is on his face, and you can see in his face that he's figuring it out, and finally puts two and two together, and you just watch his face like, good old Spider-Man, right as it turns green, which is such an awesome pileup of little metaphorical pieces all together. For one, you've got obviously stop and go. He's now in control, and he's moving because he knows the truth about who Spider-Man is. There's also my favorite piece of it is Spider-Man is usually color coded red, and the Vulture usually is strongly green, including in this movie. And it shows the shift in the power dynamic of this moment, where up until that very moment, Peter had at least the ability to conceal the fact that he was Spider-Man, and now the Vulture knows his true identity, and now he's in control, and now everyone's in danger because he has that information. And it's such a good shot. It's such a ridiculously good piece of all of this. There's so many other things I could talk about. Peter having to get through the park but not being able to swing on anything because it's just a horizontal surface is really great. This movie is also a great opportunity to have Peter deal with environments that are not very friendly to Spider-Man. The Washington Monument doesn't have anything for him to swing onto, so he has to just climb it. Likewise, the New York ferry is not, it's a very tightly enclosed area and not very tall and not very large, so he's got to be more nimble and jump around, and eventually he's got to pull the thing together in a way that feels very similar to the train scene from Spider-Man 2. I forgot that this movie literally opened on an awesome fanfare version of Spider-Man, of the Spider-Man theme, which is pretty cool. But something that's kind of neat about Spider-Man in the MCU is that they always pair him with somebody. There's always some character that he is teamed up with for the movie in some capacity. Interestingly, this is the one that does it the least. This movie very much marketed itself as Spider-Man and Iron Man take on a thing, but Iron Man is barely here. But this is basically Spider-Man featuring Iron Man. And it's kind of interesting to see how that evolves over the course of this franchise. I think that's about all that I have. Oh, no, there's actually two more very important bits here. One, there's a lot of complaints that this movie got started, and they're not wrong, about the fact that Peter Parker is kind of an Iron Man Jr. in the MCU. And if you think that, then good, because this movie does too. Tony Stark shows up to take his suit away. The whole, if you don't think you're good enough, if you don't think you can handle not having the suit, then you don't deserve to wear it, essentially, is like, if you think that this is the only thing that makes you Spider-Man, then you can't be Spider-Man. And it's an interesting kind of twist on things, and it leaves him with his old suit with no enhancements for the final battle, which is pretty great. On his way there, we wind up with perhaps the most famous shot in the entirety of Spider-Man adapted to film, which is the bit from, what is it, If This Be My Destiny, where Peter winds up getting crushed under a bunch of rubble and has to, through the memory of everyone who's relying on him right now, is able to push up this massive amount of destroyed building and get himself out of there. It's done really well. There's a lot of great variability to all of this stuff, and I think that this movie gets a 9 out of 10. I think it's not perfect, but it's pretty fucking solid for Spider-Man's first feature-length outing in this universe. Tom Holland nails it. All of the characters are really crushing it, and we get a real good sense of how this slots into the rest of the MCU, which is important after 2 previous franchises. This is literally rebooting Spider-Man 4 years after his most recent reboot. So, like, it's important to really firmly set it in this universe, which means it's time for us to move on to... Whoo boy, this one's a doozy. Avengers Infinity War 2018. So this is the 3rd outing for Spider-Man in 3 years. And this one, I'm not going to go over like the whole movie. I've actually technically already done an R-rated review for Avengers Infinity War. So we are going to try to keep this pretty focused on Spider-Man. And I guess Team Stark, since that's kind of where he is for this. But just in general, this movie should be impossible to pull off. It's still kind of staggering that this movie actually exists. Like, the Avengers did such a good job at crossing over these different series into one mega franchise that, like, it's weird. Simultaneously, Infinity War still feels like something that can't happen, while The Avengers seems like, oh yeah, that's a little tricky, but they can make that work. It's night and day. It's such a different thing. We have dozens of characters all crossing over in this one movie. In this one movie that isn't even all that long. It's, I believe, I think it's like 235 or something like that. It's not much longer than some of the other movies, but they do an unbelievable job of pulling it all together and making it work. It's really impressive, honestly, that all of these different plot lines all sync up and they all weave together. And the whole thing is just this tragic affair the entire way through. You don't even necessarily realize, unless you're like starting to think about it, that the movie is essentially Thanos' movie featuring everybody else. This is Thanos' slow, steady march to victory over the course of 2.5 hours. And we start with the deaths of Heimdall and Loki, and we end with, Gamora has been killed. We end with half the universe being erased. It's a really, really powerful movie at this point, even today. And in my opinion, if I had to pick right now what the best movie in the MCU is, there's a really good chance that I would say Avengers Infinity War. So many balls in the air. They have so many plot lines, and they all work. And a lot of these characters have advancements to their own character. Like, so our main focus for this segment of the review is going to be on kind of Team Stark, which is Tony Stark, Doctor Strange, Peter Parker. The 3 of them are the ones who together fight against the Q ship when it invades New York, along with Wong, and Bruce Banner isn't really able to help out, but he's there. But Wong stays behind while everybody else is going up into the Q ship. Peter gets his new Iron Spider suit to help him survive, the upper atmosphere. Tony tries to get him to get pulled back to Earth, but he actually grabs on, stays on, and the 3 of them are now forced to fight off. I forgot is it Ebony Maw? I think Ebony Maw is the Black Order member that's there, and then continue on to Titan, where they're going to fight against Thanos. We get to see for the first time what spider sense looks like physiologically with Peter, and in this case, at the very least, it looks essentially like an extreme case of goosebumps. Like, think Goosebumps, and also you're touching one of those like orb, the little lightning orb things that makes all your hairs stand up. You might actually be able to see it in the camera if I get it just right. I don't have a lot going on, but like you see his whole arm just like get prickly, and he's just like, what? And he looks out, and there's the ship, and it's like, okay, that was a cool thing to see, because we've gotten a lot of like quick Vertigo effect style shots to give you the sense of like, whoa, something's wrong. But this was cool to see that there is a physiological change as well. I think that's pretty neat. The New York segment of this movie feels like a combination of like a Roland Emmerich disaster movie and a Roland Emmerich invasion movie. It just, the introduction of the Q ship, suddenly everything is quiet. Tony Stark looks to Doctor Strange, is like, are you making your hair move right now? And his hair is kind of doing like a little thing. And he's like, not at the moment. And they look up and they just see stuff flying above them, and they go out, and like there's no music for any of this. There's just screams and panic and chaos and stuff flying around, and it looks like a storm. And they go and see this massive, thousands of feet tall spaceship, this giant wheel just there, parked in New York, and it's incredibly imposing. And they all wind up hopping on and making their way to Titan, where they wind up confronting, I guess, Team Quill, which is Peter Quill, Drax, and, oh my God, Mantis. They form an uneasy alliance because they don't fully trust each other, but they realize that they kind of have to work together in order to take down Thanos when he arrives, which he does to collect the Time Stone. Nebula shows up shortly after and joins the fight as well. And what we wind up with is maybe the best fight. I think the best fight in this movie, the Q ship, the fight in New York under the Q ship is pretty solid. The fight with Thanos is pretty iconic for this movie. Just tons and tons of wild shit going on. Iron Man, Doctor Strange, Spider-Man, Star-Lord, Drax, I was going to say Gamora, Mantis, Nebula, all doing crazy shit. Thanos is pulling moons down. He's dispelling 100 copies of Doctor Strange. All of this shit is nuts. They briefly get Mantis to kind of hold him, like keep him in kind of a stasis for a second, a mental stasis. And they literally get the gauntlet off to like here. And then he pulls it back on when Star-Lord infamously starts bashing Thanos' head with his gun. The problem is less that he snaps Thanos out of it by hitting him. It's more that he hits Thanos in the head, but also pinches Mantis's fingers. So she's like, ah, and like she can't keep him held anymore. But just a really devastating fight at that point where Thanos just lets loose. He drops a fucking moon on everyone. And this fight ends with everybody else just getting knocked out until finally it's Tony, the last one standing, and he gets just a chunk of his own armor stabbed through him. And like Doctor Strange essentially has to stop him from finishing this, you know, just finishing him right then and there. It's like, stop, I'll give you the Time Stone, because he went and saw 14,605 futures, and in exactly one of them do they come out on top ahead of Thanos. What he doesn't tell anyone is that this requires Thanos to win here first, and it requires Tony Stark to live through it. Everything else seems to be pretty much whatever, but Thanos needs to win, and Stark needs to live. So he gives over the Time Stone. Thanos goes back to Earth, where he's able to collect the Mind Stone, complete the gauntlet, snap his fingers, and there goes half the universe. And we wind up seeing, I think Mantis is the first one to go, and she's kind of like, something's wrong, and then Drax very shortly after fades away as well. And you're doing the mental math, because at this point you've already seen on Earth, for the most part, you're seeing two people in a shot. One person fades away, the other person is still there going, where did they go? And we were told that half of the universe is going to go. So in your head, any scene you're looking at with 8 people, you're expecting 4 of them to go. So we have this scene that has Tony Stark, Doctor Strange, Peter Parker, Peter Quill, Drax, Mantis, and Nebula. You got 7. So you watch Mantis go, and then you watch Drax go, and then you watch Peter Quill go, and then you watch Doctor Strange go. So now you've seen 4 out of 7 go away, and then Peter suddenly says, Mr. Stark, I don't feel so good. And you're like, oh no, not Peter. He's so innocent. He's so young. And you just have this like awful just pit in your heart and your stomach and all of your muscly zones as you watch Tony trying to comfort him while essentially his healing factor is keeping him alive longer. His spider sense is causing him to feel like at a magnified degree everything that's happening to him. The nanosuit is probably keeping him together longer too. So all of this stuff is making him endure this thing for way longer than anybody else is. And he's basically on the ground, like tears in his eyes and apologizing to Tony. Like, just because that's all that he's got left is just like, I'm sorry. And then he just kind of like fades away. And it's so devastating to see Spider-Man fucking vanish before your eyes. And it's like, there's a lot of other important characters that go away too. Tons of really important characters all go. But something about seeing Spider-Man specifically vanish to dust is like devastating. It is such a quiet ending to this movie. And the last line is Cap with 4 of the Avengers, 3 of the other Avengers, plus Rhodey and Rocket surrounding Vision's corpse, because Vision is dead. He died twice in the span of a minute. And all he just says is, oh God. And that's the last line of this whole fucking movie. And it's like, whoa, this is them swinging for the fences with a very, to refer back to Civil War, this is a very Empire Strikes Back kind of thing, where stuff starts bad and gets worse and ends on an extremely low note. And you wondering how it's even possible for the good guys to win. And it's ridiculous and really, really good and so dark and so immaculately executed. So many characters. No one that I can think of is like out of character here. Like Spider-Man outside of his own movies does this thing where he refers to like pop culture references in movies a bit more than he does in his own movies. Other than that, he and everyone are like spot on for all of this. And in fact, Peter had seen aliens at some point, and it gives him the idea to essentially blow Ebony Maw out of an airlock, and it winds up being the correct call. And we wind up getting a bunch of like follow-ups and mysteries from previous movies followed up on. We have the location of the Soul Stone, the fate of Red Skull from back in Captain America. Thor winds up building Stormbreaker. And yeah, when the snap happened, you could hear a pin drop in theaters as everyone started vanishing. Like usually at a movie, it's pretty quiet, but you can still hear just a little. With this one, it was like you could hear people breathing. It was so quiet. And I don't think I could give this movie anything other than a 10. It is so good. It is a movie that shouldn't be capable of existing, and it pulls it off so well. So that's Infinity War. And we had to wait a full year for Avengers Endgame. Wow. So in a similar sort of way to Infinity War seeming like an impossible movie, this one felt like essentially the reward for going through 21 other movies to get to this point. It is the most absurdly fan servicey thing that they could realistically have pulled off, and they do it shockingly well in such an entertaining way. And it's interesting that we're in the middle of watching Hawkeye right now, because this movie, in some ways, Hawkeye is one of the characters who gets a lot more focus in this one than the others. Hawkeye, Ant-Man, I guess they're kind of the two who get more of the like real focus. Thor winds up getting a good amount of focus here as well. But so we open on Hawkeye watching his family get dusted, and we wind up seeing him become Ronin at one point, which is obviously what's going on in the series right now, where we're dealing with the aftermath of this. But it's very interesting that like the marketing chose very carefully not to reveal probably the most like heart-stopping, devastating thing that this movie does, and it does it almost immediately. So what we open with is essentially a 15-minute prologue. We wind up, this movie has a much more strict 3-act structure than most of the other MCU movies do. This one opens on a prologue of essentially very shortly after the snap happens. It's been, I think, 2 weeks, and they finally get a location when the stones were used again. And the surviving Avengers that are on Earth, because Tony and Nebula are still stranded out in space. They're the only ones out there, and it takes Captain Marvel to like bring them back down. Everyone but Tony, who is literally like knocked out, goes to find Thanos out in space, and he reveals that he used the stones to destroy the stones. And when he starts to endear himself to Nebula, when she says that he's not a liar, Thor just cuts his head right off. And you can tell that he is just white-hot rage under the surface that he's barely holding together. And it's this really beautiful shot of him walking away from the camera out into the light, and it's all blurry. The camera just is out of focus by a lot, and then it cuts to black. And we hold on it for a long time before we finally see 5 years later. I honestly was wondering if we were going to get a flashback because of how they led that in. Like, oh, 5 years ago? Is there going to be some new thing that like, nope, 5 years later. The beginning of this movie is like, hey, you remember how you were expecting them to take the fight to Thanos, then grab the gauntlet and like go back in time and make it not happen, or just unsnap everybody or whatever? Yeah, no, not an option. He destroyed the stones and he won. And for 5 years, that was just it. Like, game over. And the audience that I was in when I saw this movie gasped. Like, audibly was like, whoa, that they committed that hard to like, yup, nope, Thanos won. He got exactly what he wanted. And for 5 years, that's all they had. So Peter Parker does not show up in most of this movie, so I'm not going to dwell on it too long. Act 1 is essentially this extremely painful getting the band back together kind of thing. And part of this involves essentially Scott Lang, along with, I think, Natasha and Steve, I want to say, talking with Tony and trying to convince him that's like, we think we've figured out a way to do this, but it involves time travel and we don't quite have it pegged yet. And Tony's like, I've got a daughter now. I'm not undoing any of this. Sorry, I'm not doing it. Which is really interesting that we now have like Tony Stark, who is this playboy asshole, cares about nobody kind of guy at the start of this. Now he has a family and he's like outright refusing to give it up, even to save the universe. But he sees an old photo of him with Peter Parker, and that is ultimately what convinces him, like, I at least should try to see if I can figure out this time travel thing. I'll give it a night. I'll see if I can do it. And he gets it. He figures out his final like technological contribution to the world in the MCU is he figured out time travel, which is nuts. Act 2 is a sort of time heist where I want to say the 10 remaining heroes dive through time to 2012, 2013, and 2014 to 4 different locations to retrieve the Infinity Stones from back in time in order to use them to unsnap the universe. Most of it goes ultimately well. on Vormir. Apparently, Nebula didn't warn anybody what happens on Vormir because Clint and Natasha are forced to try to kill themselves in order to keep the other one alive, so that because they know that the other one would absolutely qualify for the sacrifice necessary. And ultimately, Natasha is able to throw herself from the cliffside of Vormir so that Clint walks away with the Soul Stone. This is still haunting him to this day, and her sister believes that he outright killed her, which is what's being dealt with in Hawkeye right now. We also, aside from the fact that we get a lot of fan service of like essentially miniature what if style episodes or like alternate looks at how things were going, we also wind up providing the backdoor necessary for the multiverse to exist, because in the chaos of 2012, the Tesseract winds up getting knocked away over to Loki, who takes it and whoops himself away, where he gets picked up by the TVA. The universe, the sacred timeline is returned to normal, setting this alternate version of Loki on his quest, which results in the opening of the multiverse that we now play in the MCU today. Act 3 is the Battle for Earth, which winds up being basically they have the stones, they unsnap, everyone's great, but Thanos from the past manages to get himself through the time portal, the time tunnel, I guess, at the last possible second, and just carpet bombs the Avengers compound when they least expect it. And we have this just absolute beatdown, this awesome fight between Thanos and Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, and it's going okay, but they can't seem to make it happen. And at the last moment, as things look at their worst, we have Sam Wilson coming over the intercom being like, Cap, you there? On your left, and like a big portal opens. And it was such a weirdly emotional moment because something about the way that it was shot honestly made it feel so. A lot of the language that has gone into this movie, the one before it, made it feel like the snap killed them. Just they're dead. Not that they didn't exist, that they're just gone. That's it. So all of these people walking back out through these blinding portals felt like people coming back from the dead, like in a very like literal way, but also a pretty strongly figurative one as well. And in my theater, the two biggest cheers came for T'Challa, who came out first, and when Peter Parker swings in and takes off and like lowers his like he's got kind of a helmet mask in the nanosuit and reveals his face. Those both got huge cheers from everybody. And we even have a shot of Scott as Giant Man, you know, delivering the Hulk and War Machine and Rocket out, also a very like rising from the dead kind of feeling. And we have this absolutely just massive, inconceivably large army of named characters squaring off against Thanos' massive faceless army of Chitauri and Sakarans and the Black Order, all of this stuff. And we have the moment that everyone waited for, the Avengers assemble, and you get Thor letting out this war cry and everyone charging, and the music that is playing here called Portals is so good. It's all awesome. The battle itself is just bursting from the seam with even more fan servicey battle moments. Anything they could think of, they threw in here. It's complete chaos, but it's like this is the cherry on top. After 50 hours of movies, this is the last little boop right on the top. This wild fucking fight scene. Hawkeye gets to be the first one holding the gauntlet on the way out. It almost felt like this weird football kind of metaphor where Hawkeye has it. He winds up tossing it to Black Panther, who carries it for a while. And then when Black Panther's about to lose it, Spider-Man grabs it and he goes off. He winds up riding Mjolnir. He winds up being picked up by Pepper, the rescue armor. He winds up riding along with Valkyrie. And Captain Marvel winds up showing up and grabbing it. But at the very last second, as they're taking it to the van with Hank Pym's little time tunnel in there, that gets blown up. And we have our final fight here. I will say, the A-Force bit that they have when Peter Parker hands over the gauntlet and is like, how are you going to get it over there? And it's like, she's got help. And it's like, I get what you were going for with this shot. I do. If it was any other person carrying it besides Captain Marvel, it would have worked. But Captain Marvel does not need anybody's help to do basically anything. So it felt a little strange that it was like, yeah, Captain Marvel can't make it there unless we help her. It's like she can get it there entirely fine by herself. So it was like, I get what they were going for, but like it was just kind of like a little bit off. They could have given it to any other of the female characters and had that moment feel like it really worked. But going with Captain Marvel it felt a little off. So we get to our final confrontation where now the van is destroyed and now the gauntlet is just here and everyone's like, oh, fuck, now what? What do we do? We have to get it away from Thanos who's trying to go for it. So we get this 3 last pieces of fight. We have Thor and Captain America once again fighting with Mjolnir and Stormbreaker like in the scissor pose, just kind of like choking him out. We have... they get knocked away, and then Captain Marvel shows up and puts up a really good fight until Thanos in his desperation grabs the Power Stone and just punches and like sends her sailing. So we've got Thor and Cap. Then we have Captain Marvel, who is definitely like easily one of the strongest characters in the MCU. And then at this moment, as he starts putting the gauntlet back together, you just see Tony looking up and he sees Doctor Strange in the distance and he just does this. And it's just such a, like, they can see the moment that's about to happen, and Tony gets it, and he asks earlier, like, hey, you told us we had one shot. Is this it? And he said, if I tell you what happens, it won't happen. Because the short answer being no, not yet, because Tony needs to sacrifice himself in order to save the universe. So he runs up on Thanos, grabs his hand, doesn't really seem to do much, and gets knocked away easily. Tony is not on the level of strength of Thor and Captain America at all. And Thanos goes for a snap and then looks at his hand and the stones are gone. Because over here is Tony. You watch him and he delivers the I am Iron Man. And it's like, oh, Pete is devastated to see Tony, who literally half his body is just charred. And it's just, you get to see Tony finally be the one to make the sacrifice play. Peter is a mess. In the aftermath of all this, the first 2 things we see are Hawkeye reuniting with his family and Peter reuniting with Ned. Both of them are just like super choking up moments. At the funeral, there's an interesting parallel too, where you've got Peter, who wound up being a kind of surrogate son for Tony, is like one of the closest people to the water when they have the little, proof that Tony Stark has a heart thing floating down the river. And then further in the back, not really like around anybody, is Harley Keener. The little kid from Iron Man 3 actually showed up to the funeral also, but he's further away, and he wasn't exactly a surrogate son, but he kind of like the movie was kind of trying to make you feel like he was going to be in a weird way. But it was nice to see that he made it there. But yeah, we have all kinds of setups for Phase 4. Wanda mourning Vision, Hawkeye mourning Natasha, Peter mourning Tony, Steve passing on the shield to Sam, Loki escaping with the Tesseract in 2012. So many pieces of Phase 4 are set up, over the course of this. And we have this really beautiful, like, classic film feeling set of credits to close out the movie, to the point where, so you have like your really like starting ones and like this kind of like shining, almost Aurora Borealis looking lighting thing. But as we start giving credits to each of the actors individually, set to shots of them from the like various movies they were in, you notice that the Aurora is actually more of like a projector screen, kind of glowing and like, kind of shining off the screen. It's like, okay, they're really bridging that gap a little bit more for this last moment. They do it one more time where we get to the OG Avengers, and one by one we get each of them, where rather than just getting the one shot on the side with their name, instead you have shots flanking them on both sides, taking up the whole screen, and you see a silhouette of them that's kind of backlit, posing, sometimes a little rotation in there too, and their name on both sides of them with their signature. They actually like did a little thing where they signed it and that signature kind of shows up on top. It's like this really like, I don't even know what to describe it as, but it's got this kind of like really like, they really tried to class it up for this last little bit here. And you get, Jeremy Renner as Hawkeye. You get, oh my God, how did I forget her damn name? Scarlett Johansson as Natasha Romanoff. And then you wound up getting through the other four of them as well. You wind up with Chris Hemsworth as Thor. You wind up with Mark Ruffalo as Bruce Banner. You get Chris Evans as Steve Rogers. And then the very last one you get is Robert Downey Jr. as the one who started it all, Tony Stark, Iron Man. And the last thing you hear as the credits finish is just clang, clang, clang. And it's like just kind of a reminder of where this all started, which is still nuts to think about, that it was this late 2000s movie featuring a character nobody who wasn't like an avid reader of Marvel Comics cared about, wound up spawning this just gargantuan franchise that at its peak was averaging $1 billion in ticket sales per movie. Averaging. That's completely insane. Especially over the course of 23 movies. Because once we are done with Endgame, which for what it's worth, I'm going to give Endgame a 9. I think Infinity War is ultimately a better movie. This one is entertaining as hell and is just a giant dessert buffet. But it's not quite as like impactful through and through as Infinity War. And that's kind of the main difference there. I can't say anything bad about it really, other than that it's mostly fan service, but fan service done expertly. The aftermath to Endgame we first felt later that year in 2019 with So last up for this video, we're talking Spider-Man Far From Home, the epilogue to the Infinity Saga. Though it's kind of interesting, most of Phase 4 so far, with the exception of, I guess, Eternals and Shang-Chi, almost all of, actually, come to think of it, I guess Spider-Man No Way Home is the only one, and even then that's got more to do with that. Point being, Phase 4 has had a lot to do with the aftermath of the snap and the blip and the events of Avengers Endgame. Equally focused on that, along with just kind of dealing with the trauma of what happened overall in that massive event. So this movie kind of thematically matches really well with Phase 4, but it is technically, according to Kevin Feige, the final note of Phase 3 and the final piece of the Infinity Saga. The movie takes sort of a twist on a similar plot line for Peter as Spider-Man 2, which itself was kind of inspired by Spider-Man No More. We essentially have, instead of like a teen comedy, teen romance kind of movie, we're instead going, we basically got the Euro trip movie, kind of a road trip, go on vacation, but there comes a point where this movie's, helping hand, Nick Fury and Maria Hill kind of swoop in out of nowhere to just like swerve it hard into kind of a almost spy thriller kind of movie, a like trust no one style deal. It's an interesting mix between the two, and it winds up putting a lot of stress on Peter because he's kind of trying to figure out like what he wants to be. He's still having trouble getting over the loss of Tony Stark. The world is trying to find out if he's trying to be the next Tony Stark. All of this stuff is really awful for him, and he's not dealing with the trauma particularly well. And in fact, we actually get shades of the same thing that Tony went through in Iron Man 3 after the Avengers, the first major crossover movie. So it kind of where Tony went into space and briefly died. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting parallel to the same journey that Tony went on, and which is compelling here because the main thrust for Peter is realizing that he can't be Tony Stark, that he cannot be the same person Tony was. And when he finally figures this out, he tells it to Happy Hogan. Happy is kind of like, yeah, you're not Tony Stark. You were never gonna be Tony Stark. Nobody could possibly live up to Tony Stark, including Tony Stark. Like, this is not something that you need to beat yourself up over. It was an impossible task that you were never going to pull off, and that's not your fault. It's just because you're chasing this like pedestal version of Tony that didn't really exist. There's a lot of really neat character stuff going on here. We get Ned and Betty randomly falling in and out of love over the course of this. Betty Brant, who's one of the like school newscaster people. Meanwhile, Peter has a crush on MJ and is trying to confess that to her and is trying to like spend more time and see if she wants to go out. And like, they're really comfortable hanging out and being friends and things at the start of this movie, but he just can't seem to find the words for it. So we're getting those elements of this again, which culminates in a point where he asks MJ if they can go for a walk from the hotel, and they do. And when they're there, he wants to give her this like Black Dahlia, I think, necklace, because she is fascinated by and loves the Black Dahlia murders as just a thing she's into. And when he's about to essentially ask her out and give her this gift, he's like, so I just wanted to tell you, I just wanted you to know that. And she says that you're Spider-Man. He's like, what? And essentially she's like half bluffing, but she's like, fuck it, I'm going to go for it. And then he eventually owns up to it by dropping the stolen projector. Oh no, he finds the projector that gets dropped by one of the Stark drones that at this point Mysterio has stolen. And she's like, I knew it. I can't believe I got that right. Hell yeah. Mysterio is a very interesting bad guy here. On the one hand, I love Jake Gyllenhaal. I think he did an awesome job as this kind of unhinged guy who hates Tony Stark and does a really good job of like, he's kind of collected this who's who of people who Tony has wronged throughout the years at Stark Industries, and has them essentially faking a character of Quentin Beck and faking all of these elementals that are fighting to destroy the planet. And they fake it well enough that S.H.I.E.L.D. believes him. Nick Fury, Maria Hill, they believe him. They go, what the data they have corroborates what he's saying, and they pull him into the fold. And it's basically a huge power play for him to both A, destroy the memory of Tony Stark, and B, just be a superhero based on nothing. Like, he just kind of wants to take it. And he serves as kind of a neat metaphor for like movie making in general. He's literally wearing a mocap suit for basically the entire second half of the movie. Once he gets these glasses that have an AI called Edith, even dead, I'm the hero is what that's short for, I believe. And it kind of accentuates the sort of ego at the core of this. Peter does not have much of an ego. He has a little bit of one, but he's fighting, to kind of control it. Quentin, or the guy that's playing Quentin, has a huge ego and is like, I deserve to be the next Iron Man. And Tony famously had a massive ego, tons of hubris, and he passed this on to Peter, not kind of thinking about the ramifications of handing, billions or trillions of dollars worth of like military tech to a kid. He almost gets one of his classmates killed at one point because he's using it so rashly. This movie is pretty funny in the sense that it sets up a multiverse and then reveals that that was a lie, only for the multiverse to actually exist. And that actually comes into play in Spider-Man No Way Home. And his time, he winds up creating kind of, he doesn't create the fake alias. Ned creates it for him when Betty Brant presses on like, is that Spider-Man? It's like, oh no, it's a European knockoff. It's the Night Monkey. And it's just such a silly thing going on here. And like, it's a pretty solid movie. It feels a little sloppier than the first. The first is super fine-tuned. Everything is really well put together. This one doesn't feel as smooth. Though I will say the illusions cast by Mysterio are unreal. Really incredible stuff. Like, there's a point where it's a bunch of Spider-Mans beating up Peter. He winds up seeing the grave of Anthony E. Stark, where a skeleton in an Iron Man suit attacks Peter. He's in a hallway full of lockers that he's attacked in. There's these massive glass shards, all this cool stuff. And at one point, Mysterio is boasting. And then in the middle of it, he gets shot in the arm, and the illusion immediately drops. And Nick Fury walks up, and he's like, who else did you tell? We need to go protect them now. And Peter gives up that he told Ned and MJ. And Nick Fury starts laughing, and he's like, you are so gullible. You're such a sucker. And then Peter realizes, as he's getting hit by a bullet train, that it was Mysterio. So once again, by the way, he can stop a car from hitting a bus like it's nothing, and he can be hit by a fucking train and shakes it off. Like, he passes out, but he lives through it. He doesn't die from that. Fucking nuts. It's crazy. So we wind up with this really interesting kind of fight where all the elementals have fused into one. At this point, we know that it's an illusion with the Stark drones that Mysterio has control over, which begs the question of how he was doing this stuff before he had Stark drones. They don't really answer that. Yeah. There are some of them that were controlled by William Riva, but I think it was like a very small number of them, and now he's got Edith. He's got control over way more weaponry, which is how he makes the giant combined elemental. The final fight with Spider-Man and Mysterio on at the Tower Bridge. First of all, there's a great shot of him holding the Tower Bridge sign as a shield, and he's got an engine block as kind of, it's more of like a flail, but it looks a lot like a hammer. And it symbolically does a couple things. One, it evokes Captain America during the fight against Thanos, but also by kind of combining pieces of Cap and Thor instead of Iron Man. I mean, he's wearing a suit that's got Iron Man. Actually, no, he doesn't. He has fabricated himself a new suit to take on this threat. But it kind of helps symbolize that he doesn't need to be the next Iron Man. He just needs to be the best Avenger he can be. And it's not about being somebody else. It's about being Spider-Man. And I think that's kind of cool. They have a great fight where Beck winds up kind of challenging him to deal with one last illusion. And Peter, who's been having trouble getting his spider sense to kind of work properly, the Peter tingle as they call it, is finally able to just kind of like, okay. And you see him run down this dark hallway and then suddenly jump off of nothing and slam a Stark drone that was entirely invisible. And he knocks out all of them. Mysterio screams to like have all the drones fire, and this winds up getting him mortally wounded. And as he's on the ground, Peter's like, no more lies. You're done. And, you know, Mysterio finally is like, all right. And he gives up the glasses, the Edith glasses, like this. And it's such a clever little thing because he hands them off like this, you know. But if you look closely, that's also pretty similar to how you would hold a gun if you're pointing it at somebody, which is exactly what happens as he just reaches up without looking and blocks. And he knocks away Mysterio's hand, a cloaked Mysterio's hand, before he can shoot him in the head. He was about to shoot Peter in the fucking head in front of everybody. Really wild ending. Peter comes home, and the Mysterio team has doctored a bunch of footage that Mysterio was secretly taking in order to make it look like Spider-Man was the one who had the Stark drones attacking everyone. And as the final coup de grace, he reveals that Spider-Man is Peter Parker to everyone. And J. Jonah Jameson is, in fact, reporting on this universe's version on it from the dailybugle.net. And it's like, whoa, that might have been the most holy shit stinger that we've seen in any of these movies. And it blew me the fuck away. And that doesn't even include the fact that we got to see an illusion version of Nick Fury by Mysterio, but the actual Nick Fury wasn't Nick Fury either. It was Talos from Captain Marvel, who's been covering for Nick for about a year. I guess a few months at least. So that Nick could go up into space to deal with, I don't know. That's leading into one of the Captain Marvel sequels, or I think there's supposed to be a Secret Invasion sequel thing that's going to include him. What is interesting is Talos, as Nick Fury, says that it would have been awkward to introduce himself at the funeral of Tony Stark. It makes you wonder if Tony Stark is actually like, or not Tony Stark, was Nick Fury actually there at all for this? Was he the one who got dusted? Well, I think he did get dusted and wound up deciding to take a vacation as a result of that and replaced himself. Like, it's unclear if he was actually at the funeral or if he was, but he told Talos about it. Unclear. For this movie, I'm going to give Spider-Man Far From Home a 7. I think it was solid. It was a lot of fun, but it did feel a lot sloppier. It had interesting moments, but the villain was a little bit less believable in a lot of ways. And it does start us down this path of not only is Peter kind of Iron Man Jr., but all of his villains seem to be the fault of Tony Stark, and it's not giving Peter a chance to have much of an identity of his own. So this was a chance to kind of fix that, and they didn't really do it, and that's where I got to dock some points. So all of this is what is leading us up to Spider-Man No Way Home, which I'm going to have as a separate video to follow up this one, since this one's already quite long, and I don't want to bloat it out too much further. I think No Way Home deserves its own video. I would love to hear what you think about my takes on these. They were a little bit more freeform, a little bit less detailed, because I didn't want to take 2 hours on this, even though this was a very long video. Thank you guys very much for watching. If you like this video, feel free to like or comment and subscribe if you want to see more. And I will be back to talk about Spider-Man No Way Home, which I have seen. I'm still soaking it in a little too, so that might be kind of part of this as well. But I hope that this has been a fun walk through the history of Spider-Man in movies. And let's bring this through to the finale next time. Bye.